This is Stuart Millard, and you are haunted. Thanks as always for sending in your real-life ghost stories and paranormal experiences for me to share. We begin today with an email from Jasmine in Manchester. In the early 2010s, I worked on a morning talk show. I won't name it, except to say it's since been taken off air for unrelated reasons. We had all sorts on there over the years, with literally thousands of episodes of Jerry Springer type drama, benefit layabouts, DNA tests and lie detectors, drug addicts and sex addicts, and people with teeth like a smashed piano. Look, it was some real tabloid shit, and if I'm honest, it was all just an excuse to take the piss out of the vulnerable. But it was steady work, and I thought it might get me an in to Loose Women or one of the soaps. People wonder why someone would want to humiliate themselves on a show like that. We always told the guests that if they wanted some help with their problems, we'd provide it, give them the chance to put their side of the story across, with access to our counsellor, plus a night in a Travelodge, which happened to be round the corner from an offie. Then we brought them out to get booed by the audience and shouted at by the host. As the ratings proved, people loved watching him yell at all the guests, berating them to get a job or stop taking drugs, or telling deadbeat dads to wear a condom. I started as a runner, fetching coffees and cue cards, but worked my way up to dealing with the guests, who often had stage fright or second thoughts. They'd frequently become upset by what was happening on stage and storm off set, and my job was to calm them down and convince them not to walk out before we'd finished filming. We taped episodes in batches, and one morning we had a show titled "Back Off Drac, I'm a Real Vampire." This was more of a light relief episode, sandwiched between a guy who'd sold his mum's house while on the smack, and a dad of 8 who claimed to be Britain's biggest shagger with a cock like a Pringles can. This one, it was still just wheeling out weirdos for the audience to laugh at, except it was goths rather than quote-unquote chavs. The guests, all self-confessed vampires, came out one at a time for their interviews, and the first was a bloke from Essex calling himself Count Keith. He was wearing plastic fangs and a cape, and said that he slept in a coffin. We did a few gags about his friends calling him a pain in the neck, and he threw a rubber bat into the audience before the host came at him with a crucifix while he pretended to recoil. It was all tongue-in-cheek, harmless. Next was a couple who'd had their teeth filed into points and bit each other during sex. There was a real swingers vibe about them. Her sat in a leather dress almost showing the lot, and him looking like he hadn't showered since Barrymore was on telly. There was a bit I knew would never make the show, where she talked about drinking a shot glass full of dick blood, which had the audience dry heaving. But these were just light relief compared to the final guest, who was simply called William. When he came out, William was just in regular trousers and a polo shirt. I remember this had caused a big drama backstage, with production insistent we dress him in a puffy shirt like that Brad Pitt film, just to accentuate the vampireness, but he absolutely refused. We'd given Count Keith the cloak to wear, and the Randy couple had just turned up dressed like that. But William wasn't having it, and he was very persuasive. When it came time to do his makeup, he insisted all the mirrors be covered over before he even went into the room. We humoured him on that one, but filmed the whole process so we could play it back as extra footage when he came on, knowing it would make for great TV. I think in the end, the fact he was so unassuming is what made it work. Sat there looking like a supply teacher, and very matter-of-factly insisting that, unlike the other guests, he was a real vampire, genuinely undead, and sustaining himself for over 900 years by feasting on the blood of the living. The host asked why he wanted to out himself now, and he said he was bored, and that it didn't matter if people saw him on there, as he'd be able to change his appearance anyway. He'd been doing that for centuries. It was still all pretty jovial and light-hearted, until he casually mentioned killing people. Hundreds of people. Maybe thousands. If any guests confess to a crime, we're legally bound to contact the authorities. But he was obviously a nutter, and most of his supposed murders had taken place hundreds of years ago. Sat there in the middle of the stage, either side of commercial breaks for holidays and stool softeners, William begun reeling off a random list of people he'd killed. Peasants and noblemen, enemies and lovers, farmers, soldiers, mothers, a wagon full of children in the 16th century, a homeless man he'd hypnotised outside of a Greg's 3 days earlier. Countless names he'd forgotten and faces he'd never learned, as he drank from their throats until they were empty. William had a secret Facebook account and said that sometimes he'd see people sharing those appeals for missing family members. It's so out of character and all of that, and recognised them as a recent meal. By this point, the audience had gone from laughing to abject silence, while the host stamped his feet and did his outraged thing, wondering aloud what kind of sick, pathetic mind would make up something so vile, as the on-stage security guards inched closer, just in case. On William's own suggestion, he'd submitted to a lie detector test. These, along with DNA tests, were a real trademark of the show. While lie detectors are far from 100% and inadmissible in court, we always treated them as infallible. I've lost count of the amount of guests who protested their innocence, their life now in ruins because of the result, as the host called them scum while the audience jeered. Odds are, at least 1 in 10 of those had been screwed over. The results were brought on in an envelope and read out one at a time. The first question was, "Are you a real vampire?" To which William, of course, had answered yes. I'll never forget the look in the host's eyes as he read it out. The lie detector test says he's telling the truth. Then came the rest. Are you over 900 years old? True. Do you have to drink human blood to survive? True. Have you committed countless murders over a period of centuries? True. As I said, lie detectors are by no means perfect. There's even that episode of Seinfeld where Jerry's trying to trick one, and George tells him, "It's not a lie if you believe it." William wasn't a real vampire. He was, like many of our guests, simply deluded, unwell. Right after that, someone in the audience stood up and asked him to prove it by turning into a bat. That seemed to lighten the mood a little, to break the tension, and William even smiled and laughed it off. He said he didn't mind jokes like that, and that the only thing he really hated was when people took the piss by pretending to be a vampire when they weren't. This, he said, was disrespectful. He compared it to blacking up. It was the only time he almost lost his cool, clearly livid about the joke shop Draculas, as he put it, skipping about at Halloween, or people who thought they were vampires just because they were pale and listened to Marilyn Manson, but couldn't suck the blood off a pricked finger without retching. You shouldn't pretend to be something you're not, he said. It's not right. And then that was the end of the taping. Everything finished without incident, and after a quick break to reset, we were on to the next episode. Some bloke who'd knobbed his dad's girlfriend on a bouncy castle. As we banged the shows out really quickly, there was an edit suite on site, and as I used to get their coffees, I was friendly with the editor. The next morning, as I was walking past, he called me in, sat me down in front of the footage from the day before and pressed play. There was Keith and the horny goths. Then it got to the final section, where the audience sat watching as the host ranted away, to a completely empty chair. The episode never aired because William just wasn't on it. Even where his voice had been, on the film there were just these silent gaps in the conversation. Nothing was untoward on the day, but on screen the camera was cutting back to an empty seat, the audience reacting to seemingly nothing. I think it was a couple of days later when Count Keith's family contacted the production team. They said he was missing. He'd not arrived back home after the show, and they hadn't heard from him since they wished him good luck over the phone, right before he walked out on stage. It's so out of character, they said. I suppose I feel a bit bad about that one, because it was me who convinced him to put the cloak on, and the plastic fangs. This letter is from Josh. Last year, I became a first-time homeowner. It's in a nice area, semi-detached, with a decent-sized garden, and a spare room I figured I could use as an office. It's a huge step up from the last place, a mouldy flat with a boiler which never worked, and a landlord who only answered texts if you told him the rent was going to be a bit late. Now I had somewhere decent, I'd been looking forwards to having people over. Board game nights, barbecues, dinner parties. But I never had so much as a housewarming, as I happened to move in the week before they announced the first lockdown. Previously, I'd always had flatmates, and this was the first time I'd lived by myself. Someone had asked me, "Won't you be lonely?" But I said I'd be glad of the freedom. No more having to wait for the bathroom, or listen to other people's throat clearing or squeaky beds. Of course, I didn't know I was about to be stuck on my own for the next few months. Well, sort of. When lockdown happened, I still hadn't unpacked, with stacks of cardboard boxes in every room, and still lazily washing out the one mug every time I made a drink. Fortunately, I'd been furloughed, and at least unpacking everything gave me something to do for a while. That was when I first noticed it. That initial week, before the fatigue set in, I was feeling very industrious. I think we all were, everyone baking bread or starting podcasts. I'd been sorting out the shelves in the living room, books, box sets, ornaments, and managed to get the whole thing done in a day. When I'd finished, I went and soaked in the bath for a treat, knowing I still had all the fun of squashing the boxes flat. With nobody living underneath me anymore, I could clomp around as noisily as I liked, and stamped on the boxes like Godzilla, coming down on the last one with both feet like a toddler in a puddle. But I turned my ankle after landing on something still inside. There was a Funko Pop in there. It was from the Allo Allo collection. Rene with his tea towel. I thought I must have just not seen it in there when I was unpacking, but I know I'd lined them all up on the shelf, on the other side of the room. There was even an empty space where he'd been standing, between Yvette and Herr Flick. Similar things kept happening. I'd put the Sky remote down, then come back from the toilet and find it on the side, or cushions would get moved from the sofa to the corner of the room. One night, I woke to the sound of the tap running in the bathroom sink. It wasn't a loose washer or anything like that, and you had to really turn them for the water to come out that fast. And then I swore I saw a mug slide across a table by itself. But then, it was the middle of a pandemic, and like everyone, I was mentally frazzled. That first couple of months, daily death toll on the news, the whole world locked inside their homes. It just made me paranoid, too afraid to pick the gas bill off the mat in case the postman had gotten COVID all over it, thinking every little sneeze or frog in the throat would have you in intensive care by the end of the week. Nobody was thinking straight, and my sleep routine was knackered. Sat around all day with nothing to do but worry about whether my friends and family were all going to die. No routine. No reason to even get up. Most mornings I'd lay there doom-scrolling through my phone, or watching big-breasted Americans dance in bikinis on TikTok. One day, it must have been about 11 AM. With that level of quiet we only got in the first lockdown. Barely any cars on the road. No groups of people talking as they walk by. Halfway between bliss and the post-apocalypse. As I'm laid there, suddenly there's this furious banging on the wall. Right behind my head. I wondered what I'd done to annoy the new neighbour like that, thumping at me like it was 3 AM and I was blasting out some Slayer. But then I realised the neighbours were on the other side of the house, and there was nothing beyond the bedroom wall. And it was upstairs. Even though I definitely hadn't been asleep, I tried to tell myself I was, just so it would make sense. It was probably more jarring because I hadn't had any real contact with another human for weeks, outside of the family Zoom quiz every Friday night. Did all my shopping online. Couldn't be asked for PE with Joe Wicks, never mind a walk. But after the banging incident, I started having the sense that someone was watching me, wherever I was in the house. For that week's quiz, the theme was 80s movies, and my head really wasn't in it. On Who Played Doc Brown, I said Andrew Lloyd Webber. But a few rounds in, suddenly my mum leans right into the camera and goes, "Joshua, have you got someone over?" Before I could reply, she was having a right go, telling me I was risking my life, that I'd be fined. I said, "What are you on about?" and assured her I was alone. But she swore she'd seen someone walking past the back of my chair. What with that and the stuff getting moved, I started worrying that maybe someone was living in the house. Silly, but you read stories about it, don't you? Some tramp hiding in the attic, doing his shits in an empty celebrations tin. I know it was implausible, given I hadn't left the place for weeks, and nobody could have been sneaking around behind my back without me seeing, but still, I had to go up there and see for myself. As soon as I got the hatch open, a horrible oppressive feeling came down over me like a plastic bag, and as I swept the torch around to see there was nothing up there, I was hit with a massive panic attack. When I got back downstairs, I calmed myself down with a few deep breaths, before a dinner plate flew across the room and smashed against the wall, right next to my head. After that, I just needed to get out of the house, so I started taking my government-mandated exercise, walking around the streets for hours. The first time I went out, I came back to find every knife and fork I owned, all laid out across the house, head to tail, in a long line. I followed it through the kitchen, the living room, up the stairs, until it ran out. It seemed like it was headed towards my bedroom. I did so much walking after that, so much running, anything to avoid going back there. I even joined in with the 8 o'clock clap. I was always the last one to go back indoors. Whatever it was, it seemed to get worse with my anxiety, or my anxiety was making it seem worse, if there's a difference. People talk about COVID like it's World War II, living right inside history and already anticipating the stories we'd be telling our grandkids in 50 years. What was mine going to be? Trapped in a house with a poltergeist? The increasingly malevolent presence was making itself felt on a daily basis, and I just hunkered down in my room, rarely leaving, almost turning me into a lodger in its house. But what could I do? I couldn't go to a hotel, couldn't even stay at a friend's place. But then the world started to open up again. We weren't just allowed outside, but encouraged. I met some friends in a beer garden, had a socially distanced birthday party in the park for a niece. I ate out to help out, and I never once told anyone about it, pushing it to the back of my mind before, one day, I realised it had all stopped. These things, maybe they feed off your negative energy. I read that on Facebook, although the same person also said your internet goes faster if you put a big crystal on the router. Everything had started to feel normal again, but by the end of the year, suddenly we were all put into tears, and there was talk of another lockdown. First we had 5 days to mix at Christmas, then only 1. I went to my mum and dad's for dinner, stressing the whole time in case I ended up killing them with an infected Uno card. That evening when I returned home, everything was upended. Bookshelf tipped right over, every light bulb in the house unscrewed and left in the sink, and a Richard III left right on my pillow, cold by the time I picked it up. Most people might be thinking burglars, but there was no sign of entry, and I knew what had done it. I write this from the middle of lockdown 3, or 4, I forget. Today's death toll was 1,725, and when I kneeled down to tie my shoe before going to put the recycling out, something growled right in my ear. I could smell it, like when someone's got bile on their breath, sort of sicky burps. Another couple of months of this at least. Still, it's something to tell the grandkids, eh? This comes to us from Tom in Hove. I'm a bit of an amateur ghost hunter. I was part of a local investigation group called Sussex Pigs. People investigate ghosts, but left after an incident where someone said an elemental had pushed them down the stairs, when I knew they'd just tripped over their own feet while texting. Since then I started going out on my own, and lately I've had some real success with EVP, which if you don't know, is electronic voice phenomena. Essentially you leave a recording device running, and then ask questions out loud to the spirit people. Even though you won't be able to hear their answers at the time, if you're lucky, their voices might be audible on the tape when you play it back. I've landed a few hits from this before, but it was during a vigil at an abandoned hospital that I had my most fruitful night so far. I've attached all the EVPs in the email, so if you could play each one at the relevant moment. After a walkabout through the location, I settled on the most spiritually active of all the rooms, and began by asking the usual starter. If there's any spirit people present, could they make themselves known? Then I played back the tape, and this was their reply. Make way! Make way! It seems to be saying, make way. Listen again. But you can't be bossed around by the dead. You have to be brave. So I told them I would not be making way, and pushed on with another question. What is your name? Mama Tits. Mama Tits. It sounds to me like, I don't like this. Mama Tits. I didn't know if this meant they didn't like me asking questions, or referred to the limbo they were trapped in, between worlds. I then asked if they needed me to help them move into the light, and this was the reply.
I'm asking for a sight. I'm asking for a sight.
It's a very clear response of, I must leave the other side.
I'm asking for a sight.
Whenever a spirit person is stuck here, it's always down to unresolved issues. Perhaps they're searching for a lost love, or racked with guilt over something they've done. Or maybe they're the victim of a murder that was never brought to light, let alone justice. So I needed to know. What's keeping you here on the earthly realm?
Your arse stinks. Your arse stinks.
I can't make sense of that one at all. Unfortunately, after that it seemed to be coming out with a string of demonic gibberish. Certainly not in any language I recognise. Perhaps it's the language they speak in hell. Here's a few of the utterings I captured before closing the session down, but I doubt your listeners will be able to glean any worth from them.
Eat my farts. What's in your mum's hairy fanny? Get over here. Whee! Get out of here, boy. Listen over here. Get over here.
The other side is a mystery, but one that I am determined to solve. As is the format, let's end on some short ones. Jonathan says, I went camping round Europe in my gap year and had a brief holiday romance with a French girl. We couldn't speak a word of each other's language, but it didn't matter. One day we tented up in this beautiful valley and lay on the grass together to watch the sunset. But it didn't. It stayed daylight for 3 days. Bright skies, birds singing, until we had to say our goodbyes. Scotty414517 from Twitter wants us to know, having a scan for our first child, the nurse left the room for a minute and the baby flipped me off. Both hands like Stone Cold Steve Austin. The wife never saw it. And from Watery Cum, I had a predictive dream about 9/11. The boy band, not the terrorism. Got up one morning humming the melody to Body Shaking, some years before it was released. You Are Haunted was written, produced and performed by me, Stuart Millard. To support the show and get early access to episodes, along with a ton of other content, go to patreon.com/franticplanet. Find me on Twitter @franticplanet and check out franticplanet.com for my other writing. Credit for all music is in the show notes. Yeah, mate, you couldn't lend us 20p, could you? Sod you.